London, 1822. The key trembled between her fingers as Cordelia Ashton pushed open the library door. Inside, the Duke of Harrow turned slowly, as if he had been expecting her all along. She should not be there. She should not have slipped out of her father's house alone. No bonnet, no companion. Walking 3 full blocks to the residence of a man society treated like a warning. A disgraced duke. A ruined man. But he was the only person in London who never bowed to anyone. And that was exactly what she needed. "Lady Cordelia," he said, his voice low, controlled, dangerously calm. I almost didn't believe my butler. She closed the door behind her. The click echoed like a verdict. "I need your help, Your Grace." He lifted an eyebrow and crossed his arms. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark-eyed. The kind of man who could read every lie she had ever swallowed. There was something in him that unsettled others, but to her, in that moment, it felt like the only safe place in the world. Strength, defiance, power. "My stepmother wants to marry me off to Lord Grimsby," she said, wasting no breath on decorum. "My father won't stop her. I have 4 days before the public announcement." The Duke didn't move. He simply watched her, evaluating, weighing, calculating. "And what exactly do you expect me to do, Lady Cordelia?" She pressed the key inside her pocket until the metal bit into her palm. "I need you, Your Grace, to marry me." The silence that followed was thick, dangerous, shimmering with possibility. And then, for the first time in days, he smiled. Cordelia Ashton was not impulsive. At 20 years old, she had learned that every action in that house had to be measured, quiet, invisible. Her stepmother tolerated no defiance, and her father, Lord Richard Ashton, tolerated no conflict. Ever since Lady Ashton entered their lives 3 years ago, everything had changed. The home that had once been warm had turned cold. Meals became tense. Laughter became forbidden. Cordelia learned to vanish. But vanishing would not save her from Lord Grimsby. 2 days earlier, during dinner, her stepmother had announced it as casually as commenting on the weather. "Lord Grimsby has expressed interest in getting to know you, Cordelia. A respectable widower with considerable property in Devon. Your father and I agree it is an excellent match." Her father hadn't even lifted his eyes from his plate. Grimsby, 62 years old, heavy hands, calculating stare. A man who would buy a wife the same way one bought a mare at auction. No one would save her. No one. Except perhaps the only man in London society feared more than they respected. The Duke of Harrow. She had heard the whispers, of course. Everyone had. 4 years ago, he had publicly rejected an arranged match with Lady Penelope Stanton, the daughter of a powerful earl. The humiliation had been spectacular. The scandal, unforgettable. Since then, he had been avoided, whispered about, feared. But Cordelia had seen what others had missed. Last season, at a ball he had attended, alone, unapologetic, she had watched him cross the room without lowering his gaze. She had seen him dismiss false reverence, meet every stare with icy indifference. He did not bend. And that was exactly what she needed. Someone strong enough to face Lady Ashton. Someone who did not fear judgment. Someone who could protect her, even if only out of self-interest. So she had walked out of her house, alone, and knocked on his door. And now, standing in the Duke's library, her heart beating like a war drum, she had spoken the words that would change everything. "I need your grace to marry me." And he smiled. Chapter 1. The Proposal. The Duke of Harrow's smile was not a kind one. It was the sort of smile a seasoned gambler gives before revealing the winning card. Calculated, dangerous, edged with something Cordelia could not immediately name. Amusement? Contempt? Curiosity? She kept her shoulders squared, even as she felt the weight of his gaze settle on her like something physical, almost tangible. "My stepmother intends to announce my engagement to Lord Grimsby in 4 days, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "If I marry your grace before then, she will be powerless to stop it." He tilted his head slightly, arms still crossed over his broad chest. "And why?" he asked calmly. Would I accept such a proposal, Lady Cordelia? She drew in a breath. She needed to be practical, direct. He was not a man swayed by sentiment. Because your grace needs to restore your reputation, she replied, unflinching. A respectable marriage to a viscount's daughter would be a start. A low, rough laugh escaped him. Respectable, he echoed, as though the word tasted bitter. You truly believe society would forgive me for refusing Lady Penelope Stanton simply because I chose another well-born bride? Cordelia lifted her chin. I believe your grace does not care for society's forgiveness, but I imagine you care very much about your freedom. Something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of genuine interest. Go on. I've heard your family is pressuring you into another arranged match, she continued, choosing every word with deliberate precision. That your mother, the Dowager Duchess, and your younger brother will not rest until you marry someone they approve of. He did not deny it. Cordelia stepped closer. If your grace marries me of your own choosing, they cannot force your hand again. And she swallowed, I will have the protection of a duke, someone my stepmother cannot manipulate. Silence thickened between them once more, but now he watched her differently, truly assessing her. The simple dress without adornment, the pale, tense hands, the forced resolve in her gaze. Then he moved away from the desk, took 2 measured steps toward her, and stopped. Up close, he was even more imposing. Broad-shouldered, sharply cut jaw, dark eyes that seemed to see straight through whatever mask she tried to wear. You have courage, Lady Cordelia, he murmured. Or desperation. Perhaps both, she admitted. He studied her for another long second. Do you know what society will say? That you ran away with the renegade duke. That you threw yourself into the arms of a ruined man. Your reputation will be destroyed. My reputation is already being sold to the highest bidder, she replied before she could stop herself, bitterness breaking through. I'd rather be judged for a choice of my own than handed like livestock to a man I can barely look at without feeling ill. The Duke was silent for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he extended his hand. Gretna Green, he said, as if finalizing a business deal. We leave at dawn. Bring only what is essential. No heavy trunks, no maids, and be discreet. Cordelia felt her heart jolt. She had not expected him to accept so quickly. Tomorrow? She whispered. 4 days is not enough if your stepmother discovers the plan, he explained, pragmatic as ever. The sooner we leave, the smaller the risk. She looked at the hand he offered. Steady, strong, without a hint of hesitation. Slowly, she placed her own in his. The handshake was brief, formal, a contract sealed. I will be ready, she said. He nodded, released her hand, and stepped back. Use the side door. I won't have anyone seeing you leave this house. And, Lady Cordelia, he paused, eyes anchored to hers. Do not change your mind. I do not tolerate hesitation. I won't, she promised. And she meant it. Because for the first time in 3 years, Cordelia Ashton wasn't running away from something. She was running toward her own freedom, even if it meant marrying a man the entirety of London despised, even if it meant risking everything. She breathed deeply, not from fear now, but from resolve, and walked out of the Duke's library without once looking back. The decision was made, and there was no turning back. Chapter 2. The Pact Sealed. Adrian Blackwell, Duke of Harrow, remained in the center of the library for a long minute after she left. The side door closed with a soft click. Her footsteps faded down the corridor. And then, silence. He exhaled slowly, ran a hand through his hair, and stepped toward the window. Lady Cordelia Ashton, daughter of a weak-willed viscount, stepdaughter of a calculating woman. A young lady society rarely bothered to notice, until now. And she had just offered him exactly what he needed, an escape. Adrian set his palm against the cold glass and looked out at the empty street. 4 years. 4 cursed years since he had refused the Stanton marriage in front of half the London aristocracy. Since he had said, clearly, loudly, that he would not marry because someone commanded it. Not his mother. Not his late father, the former duke. Not the society that expected blind obedience. The humiliation had been spectacular. The scandal, permanent. And since then, his life had become a relentless sequence of pressures, demands, and veiled threats. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, insisted on new negotiations. His younger brother Henry never hesitated to remind him that the family reputation needed restoring, preferably through a marriage that would erase the eldest son's mistake. But Adrian had refused every attempt, until now, because Lady Cordelia had not offered him obedience. She had not offered him feigned affection or polite promises. She had offered him a deal, and Adrian had always respected honesty. He stepped away from the window and returned to the desk, where a map of England lay open, marked with routes. His gaze slid to Gretna Green, the Scottish village where marriages required no banns, no waiting period, no permission. Perfect for runaways, perfect for renegades. Adrian traced the route with his finger. 2 days' travel. 3, if the roads were poor. They would need to move quickly, discreetly. No unnecessary stops. No attention. And afterward? He would return to London with a duchess at his side. Society would talk, of course. Society always talked. But they could not stop him. They could not annul the union. They could not force him into anything ever again. And Lady Cordelia, he corrected himself, would be free from the stepmother who treated her like merchandise. A fair bargain. He folded the map. How had she even managed to leave her house to speak with him? He glanced at the clock. 7 o'clock. By dawn tomorrow, she would either be there, or she wouldn't. Adrian knew fear. He knew doubt. He had watched men and women make bold promises only to falter at the final moment. But something in her, in the unwavering gaze, in the way her voice didn't tremble when she said, "I need your grace to marry me," told him she would not turn back. She was not like the others. Perhaps that was why he had agreed. Or perhaps it was because, for the first time in 4 years, someone had looked at him and had not seen a scandal. She had seen strength. And Adrian Blackwell, Duke of Harrow, renegade of the Ton, prisoner of his own reputation, recognized something unsettling within himself. He wanted her to come, not only for the agreement, but because for one fleeting moment in that library, he had felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Interest. Interest in a young woman brave enough to defy her father, her stepmother, society itself, and him. He shook his head, pushing the thought aside. This was not the time for that. Not the time for sentiments. It was the time for action. Adrian opened a drawer and retrieved a small leather pouch filled with coins. Enough for the journey, the blacksmith in Gretna Green, and whatever else was required to ensure a seamless ceremony. Then he rang for the butler and ordered the carriage prepared. Fast horses, provisions for 3 days, and no questions asked. Outside, the city was slipping into night. Lanterns flickered to life along the streets. London prepared itself for another evening of balls, dinners, whispers, and judgments. But Adrian no longer cared, because tomorrow at dawn, he would leave all of it behind. And he would take with him the only woman in London who had dared knock on his door without shame and ask for exactly what he could give: protection, freedom, and perhaps, just perhaps, something more. He closed the library door, climbed the stairs to his chambers, and, for the first time in months, slept without the weight of the past crushing his chest. Because the future, at last, had begun to move. Chapter 3. The Silent Farewell. Cordelia returned home just as the sky shifted into shades of burnt orange and violet. She slipped through the back door, the one she always used when she wished to remain unseen. The kitchen stood empty. The cook was likely busy in the adjoining scullery. Cordelia ascended the service stairs in absolute silence, each step memorized, each creak avoided. When she reached her room, she closed the door gently and leaned against it, her heart still racing. She had done it, truly done it. She had walked to the home of a disgraced duke, offered him marriage, and he had accepted. Tomorrow at dawn, she would leave this house forever. Cordelia pressed both hands against her chest, fighting to steady her breath. There was no turning back now. There couldn't be. She crossed the room to the window and looked down at the garden, small, enclosed by high stone walls, colorless. Her stepmother disliked flowers, claimed they were a waste of time and money. Everything in this house had become like that. Controlled, cold, functional. Cordelia stepped away from the window and knelt beside the bed. She pulled out a dark wooden chest from beneath the mattress, the only inheritance her stepmother had never managed to take from her, simply because she didn't know it existed. The key trembled between Cordelia's fingers as she fitted it into the lock. Click. Inside lay everything that remained of her mother. Yellowed letters in delicate handwriting, a lace shawl that still smelled faintly of lavender, and a miniature portrait. Her mother young, smiling softly, with the same pale eyes Cordelia had inherited. Cordelia lifted the portrait and held it between her hands. "Forgive me, Mama," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I know this isn't the marriage you would have wished for me, but I can't stay here." The tears came slowly, silently. She pressed the portrait to her heart and drew in a long breath. There was no time for weakness. Not now. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, placed the miniature back inside the chest, and selected only the essentials. The shawl, 2 letters, the portrait. The rest would remain. There was no room for heavy memories in an escape. Cordelia tucked everything into a small velvet pouch that could be hidden beneath her cloak. She closed the chest, slipped the key into her pocket, and stood. Then she opened the wardrobe. "Only what is essential," he had said. She chose the simplest dress she owned, pale muslin, unadorned, practical for travel. A wool coat, sturdy boots, a dark cloak with a hood, no jewelry, nothing that would draw attention. She folded her things carefully and hid them beneath the bed, ready to be taken before dawn. Then she sat at her writing desk and picked up a sheet of paper and a quill. She hesitated. What could she possibly say? "Father, forgive me for leaving without saying goodbye. But you know, though you refuse to admit it, that I had no choice. I cannot marry Lord Grimsby. I cannot live in this house any longer, pretending I do not see what is happening, pretending I still exist. I love you. I always will. But you chose her, and now I must choose myself. Cordelia." She sealed the letter, placed it atop the desk, and stood. The bedroom door opened suddenly. Cordelia froze. Her stepmother entered without knocking, as she always did. Lady Ashton crossed the room with the impeccable posture of someone who had never asked permission for anything. Her dark eyes swept the space, the bed, the desk, the window. "Dinner is served," she said, her voice sweet as honey laced with poison. "Lord Grimsby will be arriving tomorrow afternoon for an informal visit. I trust you will be prepared." Cordelia clasped her hands behind her back, hiding the slight tremor. "Yes, I will." Lady Ashton took a step closer, tilting her head as she examined Cordelia as one might examine a garment before purchase. "You look pale," she observed. "Wear rouge tomorrow. Lord Grimsby appreciates women who appear healthy." Cordelia swallowed but said nothing. The stepmother smiled, that cold, calculated smile that never reached her eyes. "Do not disappoint me, Cordelia. Your father and I have worked quite hard to secure this arrangement. It would be unfortunate if you did anything foolish." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Cordelia lowered her gaze, feigning submission. "I won't do anything foolish, my lady." Lady Ashton nodded, satisfied, and left the room without closing the door. Cordelia waited until the footsteps faded down the corridor. Then she crossed the floor, shut the door softly, and locked it from the inside. She leaned against the wood, her heartbeat a pounding drum. Tomorrow at dawn. She glanced toward the window. Night had fallen completely now. Stars were beginning to pierce the dark sky. Cordelia touched the key in her pocket once more. Not out of fear now, but out of promise. She would not fail. She would not turn back. Because for the first time in 3 years, she had something worth fighting for. Her own life. And tomorrow, at dawn, while the house still slept, She would walk through that door for the last time, and she would never return. Chapter 4. The Dawn Escape. Adrian woke before dawn. He didn't need a clock. His body had learned to measure time by the absence of light, by the weight of silence, by the cold that lingered just before sunrise. He dressed efficiently. Dark trousers, sturdy leather boots, a simple shirt beneath a travel coat. No adornments. Nothing that suggested wealth or title. On the road, being a duke was more burden than privilege. He descended the staircase while the house still slept. The carriage waited in the side courtyard exactly as he had ordered. 2 strong horses, provisions stored neatly, extra blankets tied at the back. The coachman, a discreet man of few words, offered a curt nod as Adrian approached. "All ready, Your Grace," he said, his voice rough with sleep. Adrian nodded once. "We depart soon. No attention drawn, no emblems, no livery." The coachman understood without protest. Men like him knew when not to ask questions. Adrian walked to the side entrance of the residence and stopped beneath the stone archway, watching the empty street. The sky was still dark, but a thin line of light was beginning to split the horizon. London slept, or pretended to. There was something unsettling about the city before dawn, as though it held secrets known only to the night. He crossed his arms and waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Adrian didn't move. He knew she would come. He was certain of it. But a small, rational part of him whispered doubts. What if she changed her mind? What if her stepmother stopped her? What if fear triumphed over courage? He clenched his jaw, pushing the thoughts away. No, Lady Cordelia was no coward. He had seen it in her eyes, that cold, almost desperate determination. She would not retreat. And then he saw her. A small figure wrapped in a dark hooded cloak, moving quickly along the deserted street. She held a small velvet pouch against her chest, her steps rapid but controlled. Adrian felt something strange stir in his chest. Relief? Satisfaction? He couldn't name it. She stopped a few feet from him, breathless, and pushed back her hood. A pale face, wide eyes, but steady. "I'm here," she murmured. Adrian studied her. No jewelry, no embellishments, only the essentials, exactly as he'd instructed. "Did you have difficulty leaving?" he asked. She shook her head. "The house was still asleep. I used the service stairs. No one saw me." He nodded and extended his hand. "Then it's time." Cordelia hesitated for barely a heartbeat before placing her hand in his. The touch was brief, but Adrian felt the tremor in her fingers. Fear, adrenaline, resolve. He led her to the carriage and opened the door. "Get in. We have 2 days of travel ahead. Perhaps 3, if the roads are poor." She stepped inside carefully, clutching the velvet pouch as if it held her very life. Adrian climbed in after her and tapped the roof. The coachman snapped the reins. The carriage lurched forward. Slowly, London began to recede behind them. The narrow streets, the sleeping mansions, the high walls hiding gardens and secrets. Cordelia remained silent for a long while, watching through the window. Adrian observed her from the corner of his eye. She did not cry. She did not look back as if mourning. She simply watched, like someone saying farewell to a place she knew she would never see again. "Are you afraid?" he asked, breaking the quiet. She turned to him, her pale eyes catching the faint glow of the rising sun. "I am," she admitted, "but I'm more afraid of staying." Adrian nodded slowly. "Good. Fear is useful. It keeps you alert." She almost smiled. "Your Grace doesn't seem like a man who fears anything." He tilted his head, his gaze steady on hers. "Every man fears something, Lady Cordelia. The difference lies in what we do with that fear." She held his gaze for a long moment. Something passed between them, not love, not yet, but recognition, respect. 2 fugitives, 2 renegades, bound by a pact society would never comprehend. Adrian looked away and leaned back against the seat, arms crossed. "Rest while you can. The journey will be long." Cordelia nodded, holding the velvet pouch close to her heart and closing her eyes. But Adrian did not sleep. He stayed awake, watching the road ahead, the sky growing steadily brighter. And for the first time in 4 years, Adrian Blackwell did not feel the crushing weight of his past. He felt something else. Expectation. As though something new, something he had not known he'd been waiting for, was finally beginning. Chapter 5. The First Stop. Cordelia woke with the jolt of the carriage. Daylight was already spilling in through the parted curtains. She blinked, disoriented for a moment, until memory rushed back in a wave. The carriage, the escape, the Duke. She straightened in her seat, pulling her cloak back over her shoulders. Across from her, Adrian was awake, his gaze fixed on the window. He didn't look tired. He looked alert, as if he hadn't slept a single minute. "How long was I asleep?" she asked, her voice rough from rest. 3 hours, he replied without shifting his focus. "We stop soon. The horses need a break." Cordelia glanced outside. The landscape had transformed completely. No more mansions, paved streets, or towering stone walls. Only open fields, wooden fences, and scattered trees swaying with the wind. The sky was heavy with clouds, but hadn't yet surrendered to rain. Something twisted inside her chest. Relief, perhaps. Freedom. Fear. Maybe all of it at once. "Where are we?" she asked quietly. "Halfway to Hertfordshire," Adrian said. "If we keep pace, we'll reach the first inn before nightfall." Cordelia nodded, but remained silent. The reality was beginning to settle. She had fled, left everything behind, and now she was alone in a carriage with a man she barely knew, headed for a place where she would marry without blessing, without family, without a single witness who loved her. Adrian seemed to sense the shift in her silence. He turned toward her, studying her expression. "Are you regretting it?" he asked, direct as always. Cordelia lifted her chin. "No." "Are you certain? Because if you change your mind, I can order the coachman to turn back. There is still time." She met his gaze, steady, unwavering. "I will not change my mind, Your Grace." He examined her another moment, searching for hesitation. Then he nodded, satisfied. "Good." The carriage slowed and came to a halt. Adrian stepped out first, then extended a hand to help her down. She accepted, feeling the firm clasp of his fingers around hers as she descended. They stood in a small clearing beside the road. An old twisted tree shaded the area, and a narrow stream babbled nearby. The coachman was already tending to the horses, offering them water. Adrian released her hand and walked to the back of the carriage, retrieving a basket of provisions. "Eat something," he said, handing her bread, cheese, and an apple. "It'll be some time before our next stop." Cordelia took the bread but felt no hunger. Still, she forced herself to eat, swallowing each bite with effort. Adrian ate in silence beside her, his eyes scanning the road, the coachman, the trees. He didn't relax, not even for a heartbeat. "Are you expecting trouble, Your Grace?" she asked softly. He glanced at her. "I always expect trouble, Lady Cordelia. That way I'm never caught off guard." She almost smiled. "That sounds like a bleak way to live." "It is a sensible way to survive," he corrected. Cordelia bit into the apple, thoughtful. There was something about him, something guarded. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't cold, but there was a distance, an invisible wall he kept around himself, as if he had learned long ago not to trust anyone. "May I ask you something?" she said hesitantly. Adrian raised a brow. "You may try. I may not answer. Why did Your Grace refuse the marriage to Lady Penelope Stanton?" The silence that followed was thick. Adrian did not respond at once. His gaze remained on the road ahead, his jaw clenched. Cordelia thought he would ignore her, or deflect, or change the subject. But then he spoke, low, controlled. "Because I am not livestock, Lady Cordelia, and I refuse to be treated as such." Something tightened in her chest. Recognition. "I understand," she said quietly. He turned to her, his dark eyes searching hers. "Do you?" "Yes," she replied, "because I refuse to be sold." Something shifted in his expression. A brief softness, Barely there, but unmistakable. Then we are two renegades, he said, almost with a ghost of humor. Cordelia smiled, a small, genuine smile. I suppose we are. He held her gaze for a beat longer. Then he stood and offered his hand again. Come. We still have a long road ahead. Cordelia placed her hand in his, letting him help her rise. But this time, when his fingers brushed hers, she did not feel only fear or relief. She felt something new. Trust. Small, fragile, yet undeniably real. And as they walked back toward the carriage, Cordelia realized something that surprised her. She was no longer alone. Chapter 6. The Inn. The inn appeared at dusk, small and unassuming at the roadside. Adrian studied the place carefully before signaling the coachman to stop. It was not luxurious. Weathered stone walls, a thatched roof, narrow windows glowing with faint, trembling light. But it looked clean, and the smell of warm food drifted from the half-open door. It would do. He stepped down from the carriage first, scanning the surroundings. Only a few people lingered outside. A man tying up his horse, a woman carrying baskets of bread. No one paid them any attention. Good. Adrian turned and offered his hand to Cordelia. She accepted, stepping down cautiously, the hood of her cloak still shadowing her face. Keep your head down, he instructed, firm, not harsh. We don't want curiosity. She nodded, clutching the velvet pouch against her chest. Adrian pushed open the inn door. Inside was small but welcoming. A fire burned in the hearth, warming the air. Dark wooden tables filled the room, and the smell of stew and fresh bread drifted everywhere. The innkeeper, a broad man with a graying beard, looked up from the table he was wiping and smiled. Evening, sir. Looking for rooms? Adrian nodded. 2 rooms, separate, and supper. The innkeeper gave them a quick once-over. Adrian in simple but well-made clothes. Cordelia hidden beneath her hood. But he asked no questions. 2 rooms upstairs. Small but clean. Stew's hot. Perfect, Adrian said, placing coins on the counter. The innkeeper pocketed the money, called to a young maid, and handed her 2 keys. Mary will show you. Supper will be ready shortly. Adrian inclined his head and followed the maid up the narrow stairs, Cordelia directly behind him. The rooms were indeed small. Narrow beds, tiny windows, no luxuries. But clean, as promised. Adrian inspected Cordelia's room first, checking the lock, testing the window, ensuring everything closed properly. Satisfied, he turned to her. Rest. We'll eat in half an hour. After that, sleep. We leave before dawn. She nodded, but didn't move. She simply stood in the center of the room, holding the velvet pouch like a shield. Adrian frowned slightly. Something wrong? Cordelia hesitated, then spoke, her voice quiet. Your Grace! What will happen when we reach Gretna Green? He tilted his head. We marry. Before a blacksmith, as is custom there. Simple, quick, legal. And after that? Adrian crossed his arms. Then we return to London, as husband and wife. Your stepmother won't be able to touch you. Neither will my family. She lowered her gaze. And what about us? The question hung in the air. Adrian watched her in silence. She wasn't looking at him. Her eyes fixed on the floor, her shoulders tense. She was afraid. Not of the escape, not of the journey, but of what came after. He stepped closer, but kept a respectful distance. Lady Cordelia, he said, his voice softer than he intended. I am not a gentleman. I don't promise romance or tenderness, but I promise you this. I will never be cruel to you. I will never treat you as your stepmother did, and I will never force you into anything. She lifted her eyes slowly, meeting his. You give me your word? I do, he answered immediately. Cordelia held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded, slow, deliberate. Thank you. Adrian stepped back, giving her space. Rest. Lock the door after I leave. I'll be in the room next to yours if you need me. He slipped out before she could reply, closing the door behind him. In the narrow corridor, Adrian stopped and rested a hand against the wall. And us? Her question echoed in his mind. He didn't know the answer. He had not planned beyond Gretna Green. Had not considered what would happen when they returned to London, when they lived beneath the same roof, when they were forced into the daily rhythm of a married life neither had expected. He had accepted the agreement because it was practical, because it solved his problem, and hers. But now, staring at her closed door, Adrian felt something unsettling. He cared. He cared about the fear in her eyes. He cared about the courage she showed despite trembling. He cared about the way she looked at him, not with adoration, but with respect. And that was dangerous, because agreements do not survive when feelings find a way in. Adrian pushed away from the wall and descended the stairs to the inn's main room. It was nearly empty now, only a solitary man drinking ale in the corner. The fire still burned, casting long shadows across the stone walls. Adrian stopped before the hearth, watching the flames shift and dance. He tried to remind himself that this was only a pact, an arrangement, nothing more. But for the first time in 4 long years, Adrian Blackwell was no longer sure he could keep that promise. Chapter 7. The Suspended Confession. Cordelia couldn't sleep. Lying in the narrow bed, wrapped in a coarse blanket that smelled faintly of old lavender, she stared up at the dark wooden ceiling. Moonlight filtered through the tiny window, stretching thin silver lines across the floor. Outside, the wind murmured softly. Some distant animal cried out. The inn was silent, but Cordelia's mind was anything but. And us? Why had she asked that? She knew the answer. She knew this marriage would be only on paper, a bargain, a mutual convenience, nothing more. Yet something in the way he had looked at her, steady, direct, honest, made her want to believe there might be more beyond the pact. Cordelia turned onto her side, clutching the pillow against her chest. She couldn't afford to dream. Not now. Not about him. The Duke of Harrow was not a man of sentiment. He had said as much himself. He offered protection, not affection. Safety, not tenderness. And she had accepted, because that was all she needed. So why did her chest ache? Cordelia squeezed her eyes shut, willing the thoughts away. But his voice kept echoing in her mind. I will never be cruel to you. I will never treat you as your stepmother did. And I will never force you into anything. Simple words, direct. But they carried a weight she hadn't expected. He hadn't promised love, but he had promised dignity. And that, for her, was more than anyone had offered in 3 long years. A faint sound drifted from the room next door. Cordelia froze, listening. Footsteps. He was awake, too. She hesitated, fingers tightening in the blanket. She should stay in bed. She should sleep, rest, prepare herself for the next day. But something pulled her forward. Before she could talk herself out of it, she slipped from the bed, wrapped her mother's shawl around her shoulders, and walked to the door. She opened it carefully, the soft creak echoing down the empty corridor. His door was slightly ajar. A thin stripe of lamplight spilled through the gap. Cordelia took one step, then another. She stopped at the threshold and knocked lightly. Your Grace? The silence lasted only an instant. Then the door opened fully. Adrian stood there, still dressed, his shirt partially undone at the chest. His hair was tousled, as if he had run his hands through it repeatedly. His dark eyes assessed her with quiet intensity. Lady Cordelia, he said, voice low, controlled. Is something wrong? She shook her head, suddenly feeling foolish. I can't sleep. He studied her for a moment, then stepped aside. Come in. It's improper to speak in the hallway. Cordelia entered, and he closed the door behind her, though he didn't lock it. His room was identical to hers. Narrow bed, small window, no luxuries. But something felt different. Perhaps it was the way he inhabited the space. Solid, grounded. Adrian crossed his arms and leaned against the wall. What troubles you? Cordelia tightened the shawl around her shoulders. I'm afraid, she whispered. Of what? She hesitated. Then the words spilled out before she could stop them. That when we return to London, Your Grace will realize you've made a terrible bargain. Adrian's brow furrowed. Explain. Cordelia lowered her gaze. I am not important. I have no dowry, no influence. I'm not beautiful enough to impress society. I'm just me. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Cordelia didn't dare look up. Her cheeks burned with shame. Then he moved. He took 2 steps toward her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. Look at me, he said, voice firm. She obeyed slowly, lifting her eyes to meet his. Adrian held her gaze for a long moment. When he spoke, each word landed with deliberate weight. You had the courage to knock on my door when no one else dared step foot in my home. You had the courage to propose marriage to a man the entire ton despises. You had the courage to flee before dawn, leaving everything behind. No guarantees, no protection, only the hope that I would keep my word. He tilted his head slightly. His eyes locked with hers. That is not being insignificant, Lady Cordelia. That is being braver than half the lords I know. The air between them seemed to thin. Cordelia felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, not shame. Something else. Hope. Your Grace truly believes that? She whispered. Adrian didn't look away. I do. They stood there, mere inches apart, the silence charged with something neither dared to name. Then Adrian stepped back, breaking the moment. Return to your room, he said, his voice rougher than before. Rest. Tomorrow will be a long day. Cordelia nodded slowly, still feeling the echo of his words inside her. She walked to the door, paused, and glanced over her shoulder. Thank you, Your Grace. He didn't reply, only gave a faint nod. Cordelia slipped out and closed the door behind her. In the empty corridor, she leaned against the wall and pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heart racing wildly. Something had shifted inside her. Something small, fragile, yet undeniable. And Cordelia realized, with surprise and a touch of fear, that she no longer wanted only protection. She wanted him to see her. And perhaps, just perhaps, he already was. Chapter 8. The Tempest Within. Adrian did not return to bed. He stood in the center of the room, staring at the closed door as if he could still see her silhouette lingering on the other side. I am not important. I am not pretty enough. Her words echoed through his mind, weighted with a quiet pain he recognized instantly. He knew that kind of wound. Not the kind delivered in a single strike, but the kind carved slowly, over years of belittlement, of being treated as an object, a piece on a board where others made all the moves. She didn't know it, but in that, they were the same. Adrian dragged his hands down his face and walked to the window. Outside, the night was still. The full moon washed the empty fields in silver. The road stretched silent and deserted. Everything felt suspended, as though the world itself were holding its breath. He should not have said what he said. He should not have stepped closer to her. He should not have looked directly into her eyes and told her she was brave. Because it was true. And admitting that truth, out loud, to her, complicated everything. Adrian pressed his fists against the windowsill. He had agreed to this arrangement because it was convenient, because it solved problems, because it let him remain in control of his life. But now, with Cordelia sleeping just a few steps away, with her words still echoing in his mind, Adrian realized he was losing that control. She was not what he expected. She wasn't submissive. She wasn't fragile. She wasn't merely a desperate young woman seeking salvation. She was someone who looked at him, the man everyone avoided, and saw strength where others saw scandal. And that unsettled him more than anything. Adrian stepped away from the window and sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, head lowered. 4 years ago, when he refused the marriage to Lady Penelope, he had sworn to himself that no one would ever control him again, that he would never bow his head, never yield, never bend, and he had kept that promise. But now, thinking of what awaited them, Gretna Green, the ceremony, the life beside Cordelia, Adrian realized he had overlooked something. He had not expected to care. He had not expected the tightness in his chest when she lowered her eyes and said she was no one. He had not expected to want to protect her not out of duty, but because he wanted to. And that was dangerous, because feelings made people vulnerable, predictable, weak. Adrian had learned that lesson the hardest way. His father, the late Duke, had been a cold, calculating man who treated love as weakness, who treated his wife as decoration and his sons as heirs to be shaped. Adrian had sworn he would never become like him, but he had also sworn never to be ruled by emotion. And now, sitting in that small room in a forgotten roadside inn, he no longer knew which promise mattered more. A soft sound drifted from the room next door. Light steps, then quiet. She had returned to bed. Adrian closed his eyes and breathed deeply. Just one more day. Tomorrow they would reach the Scottish border. One more day, and they would stand in Gretna Green. Married, bound by contract, by necessity. And after that? After that, he would have to learn to live beside her. Return to London as a husband. Face society, his family, their judgment. But more than anything, he would have to face himself. Because for the first time in 4 years, Adrian Blackwell was not sure what he felt. Not sure he could maintain the distance he always kept. Not sure he wanted to. He stood, walked to the door, and locked it. Not because he feared intruders, but because he needed a barrier. Something physical, something real, to remind him to keep his control. He lay down fully dressed, eyes tracing the dark ceiling. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees. The wooden beams of the inn gave a soft, tired creak, and Adrian remained awake, wrestling with something he could not yet name, something growing in his chest. Slow, inevitable, something perilously close to what he had always avoided, feeling. And as the night deepened, wrapping the inn in heavy silence, Adrian understood a truth that shook him. He was no longer doing this for convenience alone. He was doing it because, somewhere along the way, he had begun to want to protect her for real. And that realization changed everything. Chapter 9. Crossing the Border. Morning arrived wrapped in mist. Cordelia woke to a pale light slipping through the narrow window, bathing the small room in a soft gray glow. She rose slowly, her body sore from travel, and dressed in silence. Her mother's shawl still carried a faint scent of lavender. She draped it around her shoulders, letting her fingers trace the delicate worn lace, as if courage might be hidden in its threads. Today they would cross the Scottish border. Today they would be closer to Gretna Green, closer to marriage. Cordelia looked at her reflection in the small fogged mirror above the dresser. A pale face, tired eyes, hair pinned simply. No adornments, no beauty. But she remembered his words. "You are braver than half the lords I know." Warmth flickered in her chest. He hadn't said it out of courtesy. He was not a man given to empty praise. He had said it because he meant it. And that changed everything. Cordelia checked the velvet pouch, ensuring her mother's portrait was still safe inside, then stepped out of the room. In the hallway, Adrian's door already stood open. Empty. She went downstairs and found him in the main room of the inn, standing by the window, watching the road through the fogged glass. He turned when he heard her approach. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady but not cold. "Good morning, Your Grace," she replied. Adrian nodded toward the table, where fresh bread, cheese, and tea had been set out. "Eat. We leave soon. The border is only a few hours from here." Cordelia sat and ate quietly. Adrian remained standing, eyes fixed on the window, the door, the movements within the inn. Always alert, always prepared, as if he expected something to go wrong at any moment. Gathering courage, she spoke. "Do you believe my stepmother will try to follow us?" He glanced sideways at her. "I don't know. And I don't intend to find out." She bit her lip. "And if she catches up before we reach Gretna Green?" Adrian turned fully to her, his gaze steady and unyielding. "She won't." The certainty in his voice was absolute, not arrogance, but resolve. Something settled inside Cordelia. Trust. She finished the tea, stood, and adjusted her cloak. I am ready. Adrian nodded and led her outside to the carriage. The coachman waited, horses prepared, and the road ahead lay draped in a thin, ghostly mist that made the world look unreal, almost dreamlike. Cordelia climbed into the carriage, Adrian right behind her. The door closed, the whip cracked, and they were in motion. The landscape shifted gradually as the hours passed. Open fields gave way to gentle hills, then to rougher, uneven terrain. The vegetation grew denser, wilder. The air turned sharper, colder. Cordelia watched everything through the window, mesmerized. She had never left London, never seen anything beyond paved streets, locked mansions, or carefully trimmed gardens. But here was freedom. It's different, isn't it? Adrian said, watching her. She turned to him, eyes bright. Yes, it's vast, untamed. He almost smiled. Scotland is like that, unconquerable. Cordelia returned her gaze to the window. I like it. Adrian was quiet for a moment, then spoke in a lower tone. I thought you might miss London. She shook her head gently. London was never home, only a gilded cage. He studied her, understanding settling into his expression. The carriage slowed. Adrian leaned forward, checking the road, then tapped the roof. The coach came to a stop. What's happening? Cordelia asked, heart quickening. Adrian stepped out quickly and walked to the front of the carriage. Cordelia followed. They stood atop a hill, and ahead, marked by an old moss-covered stone, was a line carved into the earth. The border. England, the coachman said, pointing behind them. Then he pointed ahead. Scotland. Cordelia stared at the stone, then at the road beyond. On the other side of that line, she would be free. On the other side, no one could drag her back. Adrian turned to her, his gaze intense. Last chance, Lady Cordelia. If you wish to turn back, I can still take you home. She held his gaze, firm, unwavering. At this point, Your Grace, we are already a scandal in London. I will not go back. He held her eyes a moment longer, then extended his hand. Then we crossed together. Cordelia placed her hand in his, and together they stepped past the ancient stone, past the border, past the life she had known, into Scotland, into Gretna Green, into whatever future awaited them. Chapter 10. The Silent Vow. Gretna Green emerged at dusk, small, quiet, almost forgotten by the grandeur of the world. Yet for Adrian, it was exactly what he needed. A place where titles meant nothing, where no one asked questions, where two fugitives could marry without blessing, without ceremony, without judgment. The carriage stopped before the blacksmith's forge, a low stone building with a thin column of smoke curling from its chimney. The steady rhythm of hammer against metal echoed inside. Adrian stepped out first, helped Cordelia down, and scanned their surroundings. Few people in the street. A man tying his horse, a woman carrying baskets of bread. No one paid them any attention. Good. Come, he said, his voice steady. Cordelia clutched the velvet pouch to her chest and nodded. They entered the forge. Heat flooded the air. The smell of hot iron and coal clung to the walls. In the center, a broad-shouldered man in a soot-stained apron hammered a glowing horseshoe on the anvil. He glanced up when Adrian approached. Afternoon, sir? Need horseshoeing? Adrian shook his head. I need a marriage. The blacksmith set down the hammer, wiped his hands on his apron, and grinned. Ah, welcome to Gretna Green, then. You're in the right place. He looked from Adrian to Cordelia without a trace of curiosity or judgment. Do you bring witnesses? No, Adrian replied. No matter. My lads will do. He gestured to two men working near the furnace. Come on over, boys. We've got a wedding. The two approached, alert, but discreet. The blacksmith led Adrian and Cordelia into a small side room where a rough wooden table served as an improvised altar. Names? He asked, opening a worn ledger and lifting a quill. Adrian Blackwell, Adrian said. Duke of Harrow. The blacksmith raised his brows but didn't comment, just wrote. And the lady? Cordelia lifted her chin, her voice steady. Cordelia Ashton. He wrote again, closed the ledger, and looked at them. Ready? Adrian turned to Cordelia. She was pale, but her eyes were steady. No wavering, no fear of choice. Ready, she whispered. Adrian raised a hand. One moment. He turned to the blacksmith. Do you have a ring? The blacksmith blinked with mild surprise, then nodded. I forge a few for weddings. Let me see. He went to a shelf and returned with 3 silver bands. He set them on the table. Adrian examined them briefly, then chose one, a smooth silver ring with a fine engraved line circling it. Simple. Beautiful. He lifted it to the light, checking the size, then looked at Cordelia. May I? She extended her hand, trembling slightly. Adrian took her fingers gently and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Cordelia stared at it, eyes glistening. It's beautiful, she whispered. Adrian held her gaze. Every wife deserves a ring. The blacksmith cleared his throat with a smile. Well then, shall we begin? Cordelia nodded, still staring at the ring. Ready. The blacksmith began. The words were simple, direct, unadorned. No poetic vows, no divine blessings. Just a verbal promise. Witnessed, binding, real. Adrian Blackwell. Do you take Cordelia Ashton to be your wife? Adrian looked into her eyes. 3 days ago, she had walked into his library, desperate, brave, determined, and offered an agreement. Now she stood before him, about to become his duchess. He had not planned to feel anything, but he did. I do, he said, voice firm. The blacksmith turned to Cordelia. Cordelia Ashton, do you take Adrian Blackwell to be your husband? She didn't look away. She held his gaze, steady, honest, unguarded. I do. The blacksmith grinned. Then, before these witnesses, I declare you husband and wife. Sign here, please. Adrian took the quill and signed with a firm stroke. Then he handed it to Cordelia. She hesitated only a breath, then signed next to his name. Cordelia Ashton Blackwell. Once the ink dried, the blacksmith closed the ledger with a soft thud. That's it then. You're married. God bless you both. Stop by later for the certificate. Adrian paid him, thanked him briefly, and led Cordelia outside. The dusk light wrapped around them. Cold Scottish air brushed their faces, and Adrian felt something unfamiliar shift inside him. He was married, not because his mother demanded it, not because society insisted, not out of duty, but by his own will. And the woman beside him, his wife, was no longer a stranger. She was someone he was beginning to understand, someone he was beginning to respect, someone courageous enough to defy her family, and for the first time in years make him question his own rigid vows. He looked at her. Cordelia stared at the distant hills, the wind pulling loose strands of hair from her simple braid. Lady Harrow, Adrian said, testing the title. She blinked. What? That is your title now, Duchess of Harrow. She stared at him, stunned. I hadn't thought of it. Adrian stepped closer. Think of it now. Because when we return to London, everyone will know, and you will no longer be invisible. Cordelia swallowed hard. That terrifies me. I know, he said, his voice softer than he meant. But you won't be alone. I'll be at your side. She looked up at him, surprised, unsure. Your Grace, do you promise that? Adrian held her gaze, steady, unwavering. I promise. Something changed in her face. The tension lifted, and for the first time since they met, Cordelia smiled. Not polite, not practiced, not fearful. A true smile. And in that moment, Adrian felt something tighten in his chest. Something he had not felt in years. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, their agreement could become something more. Maybe it could become real. And some quiet part of him dared to want that. Chapter 11. Her choice. Cordelia couldn't stop looking at the ring. It was simple. Just a narrow band of silver, unadorned and modest. Adrian had chosen it without hesitation. Every wife deserves a ring, he'd said, steady and certain, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And now it sat on her finger. Solid, warm, unmistakably real. Cordelia brushed her thumb over the smooth surface, feeling the weight of it against her skin. It wasn't gold. It held no gemstones. It wasn't the sort of ring a duchess was expected to wear. But she was married now. She was a duchess. Lady Harrow. The carriage rolled toward a small inn where they would spend the night before returning to London. Adrian sat beside her, silent, watching the passing hills through the window. Cordelia studied him from the corner of her eye. He didn't look different. Not pleased, not relieved, not troubled. Just thoughtful, as if something inside him was shifting, quiet, slow, unexpected. She wanted to ask what he was thinking. She wanted to know if he also felt that strange pull inside her chest, the sense that something between them had changed, something their agreement had never accounted for. But she didn't ask. Instead, she looked back out the window and touched the ring again. The Scottish landscape had grown wilder. Heather-covered hills, ancient stones draped in moss, streams weaving silver lines between deep valleys. The sky hung low and heavy, promising rain. But Cordelia felt no fear. For the first time in 3 years, she felt something entirely different. Freedom. "Are you cold?" Adrian asked, breaking the silence. She turned, surprised. A little. Without a word, he reached for one of the blankets folded beside them. Cordelia blinked. "Your Grace, you don't have to—" "Take it," he said, firm but not harsh. "You're trembling." She hadn't realized. But he was right. Her hands shook slightly. Cordelia accepted the blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was warm, soft, and carried a faint scent of lavender and something else she couldn't name. Something that reminded her of him. "Thank you," she whispered. Adrian only nodded and turned back to the window. But Cordelia couldn't look away from him. He had done this, offered warmth before she even knew she needed it. Noticed her discomfort before she'd noticed herself. Small gestures, perhaps, but meaningful. The carriage stopped. The inn was even smaller than the previous one. Dark stone walls, a low thatched roof, narrow windows. But warm light spilled from the doorway, along with the scent of food drifting into the cold air. Adrian stepped down first and held out his hand. Cordelia accepted it, but when her feet touched the ground, she didn't release his hand immediately. He noticed, looked at their joined hands, then at her face. "Cordelia," he said softly. No title, just her name. Her pulse stumbled. "Yes?" He hesitated. Something flickered across his expression. Uncertainty, inner conflict, something she couldn't quite name. Then he spoke, slowly, as if the words cost effort. "I'm not good with words, or feelings, but I want you to know that I don't regret it." Cordelia froze. "You don't regret it?" "The marriage," he clarified. "Bringing you here, you." Her eyes burned instantly. "I don't regret it either," she whispered. They stood there in the quiet road, hands still intertwined, the wind stirring around them. Then something shifted. Adrian stepped closer. Not much, just enough to erase the empty space between them. Cordelia lifted her face slightly, her heart beating so wildly she was certain he could hear it. He raised his free hand and touched her cheek, only his fingertips, barely brushing the line of her jaw. "You're not invisible," he said, his voice rough. "Not to me." The tears came. Hot, gentle, unstoppable. "No one has ever told me that before," she whispered. "Then let me be the first." And slowly, so slowly she had time to pull back if she wished, Adrian leaned in and touched his lips to hers. It wasn't a passionate kiss, not desperate, not demanding. It was soft, careful, almost unsure, as if he too was learning. Cordelia closed her eyes and let herself feel it. The warmth of him, the firm gentleness of his mouth, the silent promise inside that single touch. When he pulled back, his dark eyes searched hers, looking for regret, for fear, for anything that might undo what had just happened. But Cordelia felt none of that. She felt something entirely different. something warm and terrifying and right. Adrian, she whispered, trying his name without the title. He almost smiled. Yes? I choose you. He frowned slightly, confused. What? Cordelia took both his hands, holding them tightly. Not because you protect me. Not because you saved me from my stepmother. But because I choose you. Something changed in his eyes. Surprise. Softness. Vulnerability. Cordelia, he murmured. You don't have to say anything, she said gently. Just know it. Adrian held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, slow and steady. I know. And there, before a forgotten inn in the Scottish countryside, beneath a sky heavy with rain, Cordelia understood something that changed everything. She was no longer doing this out of desperation. She was doing it out of choice. And for the first time in her life, the choice was hers. And she loved it. Chapter 12. The Return. London rose on the horizon like a wall of stone and smoke. Cordelia watched it through the carriage window, her heart tightening. Nearly a week ago, she had fled that city like a fugitive. Now she returned as a duchess. But the fear was still there. Adrian sat beside her, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He had spoken very little since they left Scotland. He had taken the blacksmith's certificate, confirmed the wedding band he would arrange for her, checked the routes, spoken briefly with the coachman, and remained alert, as if expecting an ambush. Cordelia clasped her hands tightly in her lap. Your Grace, do you believe she will be waiting? Adrian didn't take his eyes from the window. Your stepmother? I'm certain she will. Cordelia swallowed hard. And if she tries? She can do nothing. He cut in, firm. You are my wife now, Duchess of Harrow. She has no power over you anymore. His voice carried strength, certainty. But Cordelia knew Lady Ashton, knew the way she manipulated, controlled, destroyed. She won't give up easily. Adrian finally turned toward her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. Let her try, he said, quiet and lethal. She will learn what happens when someone challenges a duke. Something in his voice, cold, calculated, dangerous, sent a shiver through her. Not fear, but relief, because for the first time, someone stood on her side. The carriage stopped in front of the Ashton residence, the house where Cordelia had grown up, the house where her mother had died, the house that had become a prison. Cordelia stared at the closed door, the dark windows, the flowerless garden. Do I have to go in? She whispered. Adrian stepped down and offered his hand. Yes, but not alone. She took his hand and descended. Together, they walked to the door. Adrian knocked. 3 firm, authoritative strikes. The door opened. An elderly servant, eyes wide, stepped back at the sight of Cordelia. Lady Cordelia, we thought, where is Lady Ashton? Adrian asked, his voice sharp as a blade. The servant hesitated, then pointed toward the drawing room. Adrian entered without waiting for permission, Cordelia right behind him. The drawing room was just as she remembered. Dark furniture, heavy curtains, suffocating air. And there, seated in a polished chair near the hearth, was Lady Ashton. She lifted her gaze slowly when they entered, her face pale, her lips thin, her eyes cold as ice. Cordelia, she said, her voice soft as honeyed poison. What an unpleasant surprise. Cordelia felt her body tremble, but forced herself to remain steady. Lady Ashton rose, her posture impeccable, and turned to Adrian with thinly veiled disdain. The Duke of Harrow. So the rumors were true. You truly ran away with her. Adrian stepped forward slightly, placing himself in front of Cordelia. I married her, he corrected, his voice cool. In Gretna Green. Before witnesses. Legally. Lady Ashton let out a short, bitter laugh. A blacksmith wedding. How vulgar. A legal wedding, Adrian returned. And irreversible. Lady Ashton turned her venomous gaze to Cordelia. You have no idea what you've done, foolish girl. You ruined your reputation. You ruined the negotiations with Lord Grimsby. You ruined everything your father and I planned for you. Cordelia drew a shaky breath and stepped out from behind Adrian. "No," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I saved myself." Lady Ashton's eyes narrowed to slits. "Saved? You threw yourself into the arms of a renegade, a man the entire ton despises. You did not save yourself, Cordelia. You condemned yourself." The words cut like whips. But then Adrian spoke, his voice low and lethal. "Mind your tongue, Lady Ashton. You are speaking of my wife, the Duchess of Harrow, and I do not tolerate insults toward her." Lady Ashton scoffed. "Your wife? For how long, Your Grace? Until you realize what a poor bargain you made. Until you discover she has no fortune, no influence, nothing but a mediocre surname?" Adrian stepped forward again, his posture dangerous. "She has something you will never possess, Lady Ashton. Dignity." Silence fell, thick and sharp. Lady Ashton opened her mouth, but another voice interrupted. "Cordelia?" They turned. Lord Richard Ashton stood in the doorway, pale, eyes wide. He looked at his daughter as if seeing a ghost. "Cordelia, you came back." Her chest tightened. "Father." He took a hesitant step, as if unsure he had the right to approach her. I thought you had—" He swallowed hard. "Where have you been?" "In Scotland," she replied, steady. "I married the Duke of Harrow." His face blanched even further. You ran away to marry him?" "I escaped," she corrected. Lady Ashton cut in sharply. "She disgraced us, Richard, ruined everything. And now she returns as if nothing happened." Lord Ashton looked between them, his wife, his daughter, and for the first time in years, something flickered across his face. Conflict. Pain. "Cordelia, you did nothing," she said, her voice breaking. "When she tried to barter me to Lord Grimsby, you did nothing. When she locked me in this house, you did nothing. When I needed protection, you chose her." Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. "So I chose myself." Lord Ashton lowered his gaze, his hands trembling. "I'm sorry," he whispered. But Cordelia had stopped hoping for apologies long ago. Adrian placed a hand at her back, a quiet but solid anchor. "We came only to collect what belongs to Lady Harrow," he said. "Her belongings, letters, anything that is hers by right." Lady Ashton crossed her arms. "She has no rights in this house." Adrian's voice dropped to ice. "Then I will take that statement as admission that you withheld her property. I can involve solicitors if you wish. Or we can settle this now." Lady Ashton clenched her jaw but said nothing. Cordelia turned to Adrian. "I only want the wooden chest under my bed. Nothing more." Adrian nodded toward the servant. "Fetch the chest Lady Harrow mentioned. Now." The servant hesitated, looking at Lady Ashton. She gestured impatiently, and he hurried out. Minutes later, he returned carrying the dark wooden chest. Cordelia touched its worn surface, feeling the weight of her memories. Her mother. The letters. Everything left of a time when this house had still been a home. Adrian lifted the chest from the servant and held it securely. "We are done here," he said. He turned to leave, but Cordelia paused. She looked at her father one last time. "Goodbye, father." He didn't answer. He only lowered his head. Cordelia walked out beside Adrian. The door closed behind them with a final, irrevocable sound. And something astonishing happened. She felt no fear, no anger, only peace. Adrian helped her into the carriage and placed the chest beside her. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. Rage still simmered in him, for the way Lady Ashton had looked at Cordelia, spoken to her, tried to belittle her, but he controlled it, because Cordelia needed strength, not violence. He climbed into the carriage and sat beside her. Cordelia stared out the window, her eyes shining but no tears falling. "Thank you," she whispered. Adrian frowned. "For what?" "For standing with me. For not letting me face her alone." He took her hand and laced his fingers through hers. "I promised I would be at your side, and I will always keep that promise." She turned to him, eyes shimmering. "Always?" Adrian met her gaze, steady and unwavering. "Always." And as the carriage rolled away from the Ashton residence, Adrian realized she meant far more to him than he had ever expected. He was no longer fulfilling an agreement. He was protecting someone he had begun to love. And this time, he wasn't going to run from it. Epilogue. 6 months later. The keys rested on the writing desk, glinting softly in the muted afternoon light. Cordelia looked at them as she folded the letter she had just written. Her mother's chest key was not among them, that one she kept safe, hidden away where no one could ever touch it without permission. These keys were different. The key to the library, the key to the private rooms, the key to the entire house, the keys to her own life. Adrian had handed them to her a week earlier, without ceremony, without a speech, simply placing them on the table and saying, "They're yours now. Everything that is mine is yours." Simple words, but they meant everything. Cordelia rose and walked to the window. Outside, the Harrow gardens were in bloom. Lavender, violets, jasmine, soft colors, gentle perfumes, life thriving where only stone had stood before. She touched the glass and smiled. Society had talked, of course. It had talked endlessly. The scandalous marriage, the elopement to Gretna Green. His mother had nearly fainted, the renegade duke and the forgotten stepdaughter. It had been the gossip headline of the season. But Cordelia had learned something astonishing. She no longer cared, because for the first time in her life, she was not alone. She sensed Adrian's presence even before she heard him enter the room. "Writing letters?" he asked, his voice low and warm. She turned to him, smiling. "To my father, just to let him know I'm well." Adrian stepped beside her and looked out the window. "Has he answered the others?" Cordelia shook her head gently. "No, but I'll keep writing. Not for him, for me. Because I want him to know I chose freedom, and that I don't regret it." Adrian turned to her, his dark eyes searching her face. "And you truly don't?" She held his gaze, steady and certain. Not for a single moment. He almost smiled, then extended his hand. "Come. I want to show you something." Cordelia placed her hand in his, letting him guide her out of the room, down the stairs, through the quiet corridor. He stopped in front of a door she had never seen open. "What is this?" she asked softly. "Open it," he said, placing a key in her hand. Cordelia slid the key into the lock and pushed the door. What she saw stole her breath. Adrian watched her face as she stepped inside. He had worked on it secretly for weeks, unsure whether she would like it, unsure whether he had gotten it right. But he needed to try. The room was small but filled with light, wide windows that welcomed the sun, a pale wooden writing desk, empty shelves waiting to be filled, a comfortable armchair beside the fireplace, and on the desk, neatly arranged, paper, quills, ink, a space of her own. Cordelia walked slowly through the room, running her fingers over the wood, the shelves, the smooth surface of the desk. Then she turned to him, eyes shining with tears. "You did this? For me?" Adrian stepped closer. "You once mentioned you loved writing, that your mother taught you. I thought you might want a place of your own. To write, read, think, do whatever you wish." She covered her mouth, tears falling silently. "Adrian, I don't know what to say." He reached out and wiped a tear from her cheek. "You don't need to say anything. Just use it. And know this place is yours. Always." Cordelia held his hand against her face, eyes closing. "How do you do that?" He brushed his thumb along her jaw. "Do what?" "Make me feel seen, valued, loved." Adrian's chest tightened. He had hesitated for months to say the words. Unsure if he could, unsure if he deserved to. But looking at her now, at the woman who had walked into his library 3 months ago and changed everything, he knew he couldn't hold it anymore. "Cordelia," he said, his voice rough, "I didn't plan this. I didn't plan to feel anything. But you made me feel something I thought I would never feel again." She opened her eyes, looking directly into his. "What?" He took a breath. "Hope. Peace. And love?" She inhaled sharply. You love me? Adrian cupped her face in both hands, his gaze unwavering. Yes, I love you. Not because you needed protection, but because I need you. The tears flowed again, but she smiled, that bright, genuine smile he had come to love. I love you too, she whispered. Not for protection, not out of gratitude, but because you see me, because you choose me. Every day, Adrian leaned in and kissed her. Not like the first time, hesitant and unsure, but with certainty, with promise, with love. When they finally drew apart, he rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed. We're two renegades, he murmured, echoing her words from months before. Cordelia laughed softly. We are, but now we're renegades together. Adrian smiled, a true, rare, precious smile. Together, he repeated. Outside, the sun dipped low, staining the sky in shades of orange and violet, the same colors that had filled the horizon on the morning Cordelia fled her old life. But now, everything had changed. She was no longer invisible, no longer captive, no longer no one. She was Lady Harrow. She was a wife. She was loved. And Adrian, the renegade duke the world dismissed, was no longer alone. They stood there in the small room filled with light, holding one another. And for the first time in years, both felt something that once seemed impossible: home, peace, belonging. The key still lay on the desk, glinting in the sunset. But Cordelia no longer needed it, because she had finally found something no key could ever unlock: freedom and love.